everyone, and welcome to the Wellness Wednesday webinar series. Tonight's webinar is on the impacts of epilepsy on cognition and memory. Dr. Ann Hempel from the Minnesota Epilepsy Group is here to lend her expertise to this important topic. My name is Jessica Rodney. I am the new regional manager for Southern Minnesota at the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Haugen, and I am the Director of Programs and Regional Outreach. Just want to take a little bit of time here to tell you a little bit again what we do at EFMN about our programs and services, just to kind of get us into the webinar here. So we offer a lot of programs at EFMN. Some of them include our camp programs. We have 3 different camp programs, one being Camp Oz, a week-long residential camp at Camp St. Croix in Wisconsin. We also have opportunities for younger youth for a one-day day camp experience, and for families looking to come together to a one-day experience at camp. We have a family camp. Those are all held in June and July. Many of you may have heard of our Connect groups or participated in those. Our Connect groups, currently we run 5 every month, from adults to teenagers to parents and caregivers. We also have some quarterly Connect groups for those who have lost someone to epilepsy. And those are a great way to connect if you're looking for a way to connect to others that are living with a similar experience as you. We offer trainings. So our educational trainings include many different audiences. Our webinars fall into this category, but we also do seizure recognition and response training as well. So if you are thinking, hey, I would like my family to know more about how to respond to a seizure, if you're thinking my workplace would be good to have them trained, just know that we are here to provide that support as well. And we offer lots of options for those educational services, from doing it in person to being on Zoom like this. And we also have recordings that you can request. I'm gonna skip over the client services because I'm going to talk about that at the end. But we have our Shining Star program, which is our youth program for those ages 0 through 17. That program is really fun. It allows kids to meet each other through various ways, through a statewide event, through regional events, and it also provides them with some fun things when they join, a little welcome kit, which we have a lot of fun with. Our social events are things that are happening in our regions. So we serve the entire state of Minnesota, including, so in the metro, we have staff, but we have staff throughout the whole state. And we do cover the bordering cities as well. So if you live in Fargo, North Dakota, you're a border city, or Superior, Wisconsin, or Sioux Falls, those are all, we can help support you as well. And our social events are held throughout the state as well. Those are really events that are meant to be for everyone for the most part. And so we encourage you to go to our website and check that out. As we are ending this year, we know that we will be gearing up for our Day at the Capitol, which is the beginning of March this year. And our advocacy program, that is just one component of it. We also work to advocate at our local levels and to really listen to what you all are saying about what are the key issues and key topics that we should consider as we move into our Day at the Capitol and come up with our priorities. If you can see the truck here on the slide here, this is a donated goods truck. If you've never had our donated goods pick up for you, just know that we have this robust donated goods that program that picks up your gently used donated cloth and small items. We cover the metro and parts of southern and central Minnesota, but we also have opportunities for people to do fundraisers across the state. So I've given you a ton of information in a short amount of time here, but know that all of this information, you can go to our website, EFMN.org, and we can you can find all of these different programs in those in those pages. I do want to tell you a little bit about our client services. We really focus a lot on making sure that we are supporting however people living with epilepsy need us. So if you need resources, you need referrals, if you are looking for to connect with another person who has epilepsy and has a similar situation, we really are excited to talk to you and to get you connected to whatever resources you might need. And just to let you know that we do all of our programs and services, they're free to all people living with epilepsy and their support systems. So please know that there's not a cost associated with it. And you could reach out and you can choose. It's kind of we go by what you say, and so know that you can get some information. If we don't know the answer, we have lots of wonderful partner organizations that we work with that we can refer you to. So that is a little bit about all of our programs and services. Jessica, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about the objectives for tonight's webinar?
Sure. The objectives tonight for our webinar is to identify the impacts from seizures on cognition and memory, as well as explore the effects of medications on cognition and memory challenges, and understand how to better cope with cognition and memory changes.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We're very excited to say that this is a very popular topic. And I know that I've been in lots of groups where we have talked about the impact of epilepsy on short-term memory, cognition, things like that. So we have a good group. And I do want to let you know that we do have some events coming up. We do have an event in the Central Northland region on the 17th of November. And we have a couple of events happening in the Bemidji area, as well as the Moorhead area, Marshall area, and working to get one in the Rochester area, all before the end of the year. So there will be social events for you to participate in. If you haven't been to a social event since the pandemic, it's a great time to check out what we have going on and come out to meet and to reconnect with people face to face. That's been a really great thing that we've been able to do. Jessica, why don't you go ahead and do Dr. Just tell the group a little bit about Dr. Hempel in case we don't get her in, that we have at least introduced her. So go ahead and share a little bit more about Dr. Hempel.
Sure. So just a little bit, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ann Hempel. Dr. Hempel has been a pediatric neuropsychologist with the Minnesota Epilepsy Group for 31 years. In addition to doing neuropsychological assessments, she has also done clinical research in the neuropsychology of epilepsy. Research topics have included cognitive and behavioral outcomes of pediatric epilepsy surgery, cognitive and behavioral outcomes in children treated for electrical status epilepticus in sleep, factors affecting hemispheric language dominance in candidates for epilepsy surgery, factors associated with ADHD in children with epilepsy, developmental conditions in children and adolescents experiencing psychogenetic non-epileptic seizures. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Hempel here to speak tonight on the impact of epilepsy, cognition, and memory.
And again, just to remind you that Dr. Ann Hempel is a pediatric neurologist or neuropsychologist, for the Minnesota Epilepsy Group, one of the level 4 epilepsy centers in Minnesota. We are fortunate enough to have several level 4 epilepsy centers. And one of the things that we do get requests for is information about all of those centers. So as you are listening to this this webinar, just know that we can provide you with that list. Level 4 epilepsy centers provide a comprehensive patient experience where they not only have physicians and healthcare providers that work with people with epilepsy, but they also have neuropsychologists, dietitians, case managers, pharmacists, and it's a team approach to your epilepsy. If you have uncontrolled seizures still, or you have struggled to get control of your seizures and you were not aware that there is something called an epileptologist, it's a specialized level of specialist in the world of neurology, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to share with you all of our level 4 centers in the state of Minnesota.
There's some great questions coming in.
There are some great questions coming in. And while she's getting in here, I think I'm just going to put a few out there, and know that if your question does not get answered by Dr. Hempel right at the end, know that we are going to send all of these to her and get the answers as well. So we have a lot of questions that are coming in. Do vitamins help with memory? Are there best ways to accommodate someone who's having issues with their memory because of their epilepsy? Let's see. Having co-diagnosis, maybe ADHD or some other neurological conditions, does that impact memory and issues if you have both epilepsy and that? All right. Strategies that you would recommend for individuals who are having difficulty with parts of sequencing. Ways to alleviate some detrimental effects of epilepsy on cognition. All right, I see that Dr. Ann Hempel is getting logged in. I think we're getting close to being able to connect with her.
Now I think we're going.
I think, yep, Dr. Hempel, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your patience. I'm Amy, and I've just been chatting with our participants here. We're going to turn it over to you. We've done your intro, and just to let you know, we will have a little bit of time at Q&A at the end of your presentation. And I just want to mention to all of our participants, we did say that this goes till 7:45. We will likely go a little bit longer. If you're able to stay on, that is fantastic. If you're not, we are recording this, and so we will send that recording out to you. Dr. Hempel, when you are ready to get going, we will control those slides, and just let us know when we should advance to the next slide.
Okay. And I assume you've already done the introductions. And
we have done your introduction. Yes, we have. Thank you.
I'm not a stranger. Okay, so if we can start with go to the first slide, okay, there. So let me just say that what we'll be talking about, there's a lot of the questions that I often answer for parents when I'm talking with them during their neuropsychological evaluations for their kids. So I'm going to try to keep this very kind of straightforward, not a lot of data or a lot of numbers or graphs, things of that sort. We're going to just keep it very just kind of everyday language. So let me also say that when we think about epilepsy, there are a few really common features among folks with epilepsy. That the epilepsy, folks with epilepsy are a very diverse population, and so they often differ greatly depending on the cause of their seizure disorder, whether their seizure disorder is focal, their seizures start from one place, or their seizures are generalized, how many medications they're on and the type of medication, how severe the seizure disorder is. And they're even apart from the seizures themselves, there are family tendencies that everybody inherits, not just the epilepsy types of traits. And I'm going to, if I can exit my own, I'm distracted by the video of myself. So I'm going to try to, okay. So what we can say is, and then one other feature that can distinguish folks with epilepsy is that they can have developmental conditions that accompany their seizure disorder. And so you can have cognitive issues that will kind of go along with conditions such as ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. Okay, we can go to the next slide. When we think about the cause of seizure disorders, one major cause is genetics. And it may be the majority of folks with epilepsy that have a genetic contribution to their seizure disorder. But along with the seizure, or even apart from the seizures, there are genetic influences. And Lvov was one of the researchers that first explored this with Alan Mirsky decades ago. They found that relatives of folks with absence epilepsy could have an increased likelihood of some attention problems, even though they themselves didn't have seizures. So we can go to the next slide. And this is an example of a continuous performance test. And this is one of the tests we use to measure attention and impulse control. This isn't the exact test that Dr. Lvov used, but it's very similar. And what a person would need to do is push that button when they saw specific numbers on the digital display and not push it at other times. And so there, the machine tabulates the numbers of errors. And so we can go to the next slide. And what this graph shows is the relatives. So the dark bar represents the errors made by the folks with epilepsy. The gray bar is the number of errors made by the relatives who do not have epilepsy. And then the white bar is folks who are not either of those other groups. So you can see that those incorrect responses on that kind of attention impulse control test were elevated in both groups. So it's not the seizures necessarily we don't expect the seizures to cause those problems with attention or impulse control. Often that's an accompanying condition to the seizure disorder. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then another question, one question that folks often have is, are the seizures damaging to thinking abilities? And this is a very hard question to answer, and we don't have much data to really answer it because there are very few studies that track folks with epilepsy over time. And unless you can do that, you really don't know if those seizures over those months or years are making a difference in thinking. Okay, next slide. So this is just one piece of data from Dodrell and Trupin comparing identical twins. One of these twins, they're both 19 years old. Both of them had generalized tonic-clonic seizures. One had 7, one had 27 lifetime generalized tonic-clonic seizures. You can see that the twin who had fewer seizures had higher scores, and we would consider these scores to be kind of lower end of average or lower normal. And for the twin who had many seizures, those scores are in the range of intellectual disability. But identical twins, as we know, they are not completely identical, because even though they have the same genes, there are different influences, what we consider epigenetic factors. And this is how the environment may be turning on and off genes. So we don't know for sure that it was the seizures that really caused these differences. Okay, next slide. This graph tells us about folks who have had generalized tonic-clonic seizures, total lifetime GTCs. And what those upper two lines show is that, and let me just say that these are IQ scores, and IQ is reasoning, abstract reasoning. Anywhere from 90 to 110 is average. So you can see everybody's pretty much in that average range, but you can have as many, the folks with as many as 100 seizures are still performing really solidly in that average range. It was the folks with, more than 100 lifetime seizures and those with episodes of epileptic status who were in that lower end of the average range. Okay, next slide. So what's the upshot of this? Really, so what Dodrell concluded is that there, because there's few long-term studies, what data we do have suggests the possibility of some decline, but it's not conclusive. There appears to be a mild relationship between GTCs and changes in mental abilities, but he thought more so for those who had clusters of generalized tonic-clonic seizures. We know from other data that there can be a decline in performance just due to normal aging, not specifically, not just in those with epilepsy. So it may not always be the epilepsy that might cause some decline in memory performance, for example. And probably one of the most important things is that cognitive performance can vary so much based on anti-seizure medication regimens. And if you've got difficult to control seizures, you're going to be on more medicines, and that can reduce cognitive efficiency and test performance. Okay, next slide. The parents and others often ask, is there are there changes in cognition if you have interictal epileptiform discharges? Well, you can see, epileptic types of activity on EEG that aren't seizure, but it is abnormal electrical activity. Can that change how you perform on tests? And so one researcher, Clean, she looked at depth electrodes in a region of the brain important for memory. And she looked at working memory, kind of immediate memory, and the impact of these interictal discharges. Next slide. So as an example, so the folks with epilepsy had to had these implanted electrodes, had to remember this small series of letters, and then there's a pause, and then they have to say after that pause, what was that individual letter that they're now seeing? Was that part of that series they had been shown? So you have your time when you're shown that series of letters, you have a period, a few seconds after that, which is the maintenance period, and then you have your retrieval period, which is 4 seconds prior to the patient's response. Okay, next slide. Okay, what they found is that if those epileptiform discharges happened in the hemisphere, the side of the brain that's better for memory, or they happened in both sides of the brain, it affected accuracy during retrieval, during remembering, but it didn't seem to affect how the patients, how they encoded that information. It didn't matter how many total numbers of discharges they had, and what the researchers concluded is that those discharges have to be in the right place at the right time to produce cognitive impairment. Okay, next slide. There's one additional study I thought it might be helpful to kind of illustrate this concept. Again, we had patients with depth electrodes in the temporal lobes and the frontal regions, and they had to perform several tasks. One was what we call auditory naming. So answering questions like, this is a person who flies to the moon, and you would say astronaut. And then the other task was repeating single words. And then they looked at the degree to which the errors were associated with the discharges that overlapped that stimulus that they were shown or heard, and then 2 seconds afterward. So what they found is that though the interictal discharges in the outside of the temporal area could increase reaction time when they're repeating single words. It didn't interrupt, it didn't stop it altogether, but it just delayed their reaction a bit. And that those interictal epileptiform discharges in the mesial or middle part of the temporal lobe decreased their word finding accuracy from 93% to 79%. So the bottom line here is that those little bursts of abnormal electrical activity don't cause an all or none type of phenomenon. It doesn't prevent complete processing, but it increases the likelihood of errors, and it appears to perhaps in some cases delay the reaction time. Okay, next slide. So, here's this continuous performance test again. And for many years in the 90s, we had kids perform this kind of test during EEG recording to see if their inattentive errors or their impulsive errors were related to epileptiform discharges. And pretty uniformly, we found there was no relationship whatsoever. So it's unclear if the epileptiform discharges are having a significant practical impact on people's day-to-day life. We can find that the impact with these experimental studies, but we don't know, does it make a significant difference in just ongoing processing, whether you're sitting in the classroom or performing your job? Next slide. Okay, so what's the bottom line? The best we know from these researchers is that the longer discharges, those greater than 3 seconds, seem to interfere, cause this transitory cognitive impairment, or more likely to cause that. But they said it can be difficult to differentiate between these discharges and what could be electrographic seizures, and then you'd expect more prominent interruption and thinking. It's more, the interruption in thinking is more common if those discharges are on both sides of the brain or generalized, and they're more likely to be seen when folks are performing more complex tasks. Okay, next slide. Okay. One factor that folks with epilepsy have in common is they're treated with medications, and the kinds of changes we'd expect with medications center on processing speed and working memory, essentially aspects of efficiency and thinking. Okay, next slide. So this is the groove pegboard test, and this tells us about dexterity and what can happen to manual dexterity with a higher medication burden, as you can be slowed down and execute this kind of task more slowly. Okay, next slide. Working memory, here are some examples. So if you're given a phone number and you don't have your phone with you, you have to remember that phone number until you reach your phone. Giving a child some directions, like put on your socks, brush your hair, and get your backpack. That's a long string of information, and that being able to retain that long of a string of information can be more difficult if you have a higher medication burden. And then listening to a teacher in class, being able to efficiently make sense of the instructions and remember that long string of language that she's uttering as she's giving those instructions, that can be harder if you've got a higher medication burden. Okay, next slide. Being able to transcribe notes. You're taking notes in class. It can be hard to quickly kind of listen, hear the information, and write it down. So transcribing by paper and pencil can be slowed down with higher medication effects. Okay, next slide. Okay, so rather than presenting a lot of data on different scores, different one medication versus another, graphs and tables, I'm just going to kind of sum up the general principles of what we know. Most folks who are treated with a single anti-seizure medication, especially ones that are among the newer medications, will tolerate that just fine without us being able to see any differences on testing, without them noticing much of a change in their mental efficiency. As you increase the dose or you increase the number of the seizure medicines, that can result in greater inefficiency, slower motor speed, slower mental processing and working memory. Topamax and Zonegran are a little different. They're on average less well tolerated than the other medications. And they can also have other effects besides just slowing you down. Some folks have trouble with ease of speech, their verbal reasoning. They can become a bit confused, like understanding explanations. And this we would be more likely to see if it's an adjunctive or add-on medication to their regimen. Lamictal and Keppra tend to be pretty well tolerated, and as are newer medications generally. Okay, next slide. Okay. When folks with epilepsy they often complain of memory problems, and it can be any number of concerns about memory, not all of which are epilepsy specific. So these are different types of memory, some not memory at all, and we'll go through each of these. But I highlight working memory. Again, that's that immediate memory for information, and that with higher medication burden can be problematic for some folks with epilepsy. Let me also say that there's a lot of individual variability and tolerance for medication. So this is going back to that previous slide. Some folks can tolerate a lot of medicine without being slowed down. Some have trouble tolerating even a single medicine. So and some folks can tolerate the Topamax and Zonegran just fine, others not. So we never know if until something is tried, if it's going to be troublesome for a patient. Okay, next slide. Okay, so temporal lobe epilepsy is a common type of focal epilepsy, and here I've got a picture of the brain. The temporal lobe is that earmuff shape lobe, and a common area that's involved in temporal lobe epilepsy is the middle part of that, or the kind of inside of that lobe is where there are important memory structures, such as the hippocampus and parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, next slide. Now, the kinds of memory controlled by those middle part of the temporal lobe are what we call episodic and declarative memory. So episodic is remembering the kind of autobiographical details, remembering events of your day. So things like remembering what happened when you moved into the dorm, remembering details of your wedding day, remembering details of your vacation. So the fact that you can, a week later, give a detailed description to people of what happened, that is your episodic memory. And then other, declarative memory, this is not necessarily, it's not autobiographical, it's memory for new content, new stuff. So it could be memory for what was discussed in a conversation, being able to remember the grocery list that you forgot at home. So still remembering what was on that list, remembering a new route that you just took without having to do Google Maps, and remembering new faces. So again, this declarative memory, it's memory for new stuff. It's not skills, it's content. Okay, next slide. Okay, so, but memory, when it is difficult for you, what happens is that the process of remembering becomes more deliberate and effortful. And so a typical person might not have any trouble at all, just kind of hearing something and having good retention. But if you have some memory problems, you need to work at it a little bit. One thing is you have to make sure you're paying attention. And so often, if you're not really concentrating on what you're needing to remember, you're not going to remember it. So paying attention comes first. The more you think about the information, the more likely it is to be remembered. As an example, this morning I was going for a walk and I heard something on the radio I wanted to remember. I had no way to take note of this. So I just thought, okay, the name of this kind of autism center that I wanted to remember, it's got the same name as one of our colonial statesmen. And so I linked that with the name of that famous person. And so when I got to work, of course, I could remember what that autism center was. So, but you have to kind of actively think about the information to remember it. Writing it down, of course, helps. If sometimes if you have bad enough memory troubles, we'll suggest for students that they reduce demands for memorization and just focus on the key demands or requirements for mastering the content in the course. And then thinking about what you're reading as you read can be helpful. Okay, next slide. Semantic memory. This is kind of stored knowledge. So this isn't necessarily specific details or kind of recalling events. It's information like, who was the first president of the United States, or who is our current president. So this is, you're not remembering the circumstances when you learn that information, you just know it. And when you just have this fund of knowledge, again, that's different from episodic or declarative memory. And this would not be typically a hardship for folks with epilepsy, unless they have other learning conditions. Okay, next slide. Procedural memory, these are skills. So this isn't content. This is entirely different, not caused by those, or not remembered by those typical memory structures that we usually think of in the middle part of the temporal lobe. Okay, next slide. Okay, prospective memory. This is remembering to do. So remembering to stop off at the grocery store to pick up groceries on your way home from work, remembering to take home outerwear from school, remembering to stop off at the ATM. And we would say, well, why is this not memory? I mean, memory as we conceived of it with kind of like memory for events. And this has more to do with concentration and conscientiousness, organization, than it does other aspects of memory. So it's not necessarily information that you've truly forgotten. So you get home from the grocery store, or you get home from work and your spouse says, okay, did you pick up the milk and bread? And you say, oh, shoot. No. Now when you say, oh, shoot, it means you did remember, but you didn't remember at the right time. So what one does when they're remembering to do is they're kind of keeping that, keeping that memory of that task, that need to perform that, active in your mind. And so one thing that can be helpful here is if you can imagine yourself executing that task later on in the day or the next day. So if you can imagine yourself carrying that out, that will help you remember putting Post-it notes where you're going to see them on your steering wheel, on your bathroom mirror, on the kitchen microwave, places where you're definitely going to be noticing. That can also help. Reminders in your phone and your calendar, your electronic calendar or paper calendar can help as well. Next slide. And remote memory, this is memory for things that happened long ago. So this is one of the last things to go when there's decline in memory with aging. Typically, this is not something that's a concern for most folks with epilepsy. Okay, next slide. What is not memory? Learning new math skills isn't memory. That's a skill. Again, it's not content. Learning to read is not memory. Learning how to spell is not memory, although, of course, they're not remembering the correct spelling if they're having some spelling troubles, but it's controlled by a different part of the brain. And then word finding troubles, that has more to do with language than memory. Okay, next slide. To be able to remember things, you need to process it. And processing is, taking in and making sense of the information. But there's a host of ways you can process information. So when a parent tells me their child has trouble with processing, we try to get to the bottom of what that looks like. Is it paying attention? Because you can't really process anything if you're not tuned in. Is it trouble systematizing things, being your own self-manager, and being self-directed? Is it trouble processing spatial information, like a diagram? Some people have trouble with that, but not other things. Is there trouble with processing language? So just understanding what's said, for example. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is just an example of when there's trouble with language processing, how it can feel. So I'll have you take a second to read the blue passage and then the red passage. So reading this, you get the idea that language can vary in its complexity, and for somebody who might have language troubles related to temporal lobe or frontal lobe epilepsy, if it's their language dominant hemisphere, it can, or if they just have a developmental language disorder, it can be hard to understand more complex language. So sometimes folks will say, well, my daughter or son has trouble with memory. And they read a passage and they don't really remember anything from it. And sometimes the reason for that is that they never quite understood it to begin with because the language was too complex for them. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what can you do when there are some memory difficulties? This is what parents will often do for the kids if they have language troubles, and that's simplifying the wording, so that if it seems like the level of vocabulary or the length of an utterance might be hard for their kids to understand, using visual aids and demonstration to help with understanding, using word banks instead of requiring kids to just remember and think of new terms like photosynthesis or catalyst. Those learning new terminology can be hard for folks with some language problems. Clarification of instructions as needed, and then limiting demands for memorization of new terminology and focusing on their understanding of concepts instead of learning new terms would all be some ideas. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of the common coexisting conditions in epilepsy is ADHD. and is much higher in folks with epilepsy than in the general population. So in the general population, it's about 8 to 10%. Folks with epilepsy, as many as 30 to 40%. More common, even still, in kids and folks with childhood absence epilepsy. And then also higher in kids who have both epilepsy and delays, and in kids who have limited seizure control, who have trouble, difficult to control epilepsy. It's not the EEG, this abnormal electrical activity that's causing ADHD, and it was we did some research during the 90s that explored this a bit. There was no relationship between ADHD and how good a child's seizure control was, the number of medications they were on. In fact, we actually found kids whose seizures were better controlled to be more likely to have ADHD. So that the International League Against Epilepsy, their consensus paper, suggested, because of this high incidence of ADHD in kids with epilepsy, that they should be screened beginning at age 6. Okay, next slide. Okay, so ADHD, there's some misconceptions about what it is. It's not really a problem with concentration per se, because we know that kids who have attention problems can often do fine concentrating on the things they like to do, playing video games, for example, or watching YouTube videos. It's really a problem of motivation and doing things that you don't like to do. So that what we think of as inattentiveness, it's manifested by trouble sustaining effort on tasks that are tedious, routine, or mentally effortful. So, and this is, homework and chores and sometimes self-care. The impulsiveness is also a core feature of ADHD, also unrelated to the epileptiform activity, and certainly not caused by medications. But this makes it hard for kids to comply with rules. They know the rule, they just don't remember to follow it. They tend to be impulsive in their expression of emotions. So those emotions tend to be raw and unfiltered. They have trouble waiting for things they want. They have trouble being patient when they're frustrated, and they have trouble stopping a behavior when they're asked to stop it. Okay, next slide. Okay, in adults, these are not the formal diagnostic criteria, but they probably should be. The features of ADHD in adults, the formal diagnostic criteria were never really adjusted to match how ADHD is manifested in adults. But they can be easily distracted, and again, this would be typically during less preferred activities, making impulsive decisions, trouble stopping, they're taking a break, watching YouTube, and getting back to their work. That would be more difficult for them. Doing things without considering instructions carefully, trouble following through on commitments, doing things in an unsystematic way, driving fast, and then, of course, just as we'd see in kids, trouble sustaining attention, particularly in non-preferred activities, and trouble being organized in tasks. Okay, next slide. Now, often ADHD medications are completely appropriate for kids with epilepsy. The medications don't interact with the seizure medications, so there's really no contraindication from an epilepsy standpoint for trying the medications that are usually used for ADHD. Of course, this can vary by patient, but on average, epilepsy is usually not a reason to not treat. So doesn't increase seizure frequency, much if at all. And we know that the non-stimulant atomoxetine tends not to be as effective as the traditional stimulant medications. And just like the general population, the vast majority of kids with epilepsy respond favorably. And by favorably, we mean that they have less trouble sustaining effort. They're more compliant to rules and directions, and they can be more patient in their emotions. Okay, next slide. Okay. Learning disabilities often co-occur with epilepsy, and they occur in epilepsy at higher rates than in the general population. But these conditions are also common in the general population. So we'll go over some of the features of these conditions. Okay, next slide. Okay, so reading disorder, contrary to conventional wisdom, it has nothing to do with visual processing. It's actually related to trouble with awareness of word sounds. And it makes it hard to be aware of the sounds produced by individual letters. And so young kids with trouble with word sounds can have trouble blending those letters to read single words. Often we'll see, if it's not a specific reading disability, some reading delays can parallel kids' delays in other respects. Okay, next slide. Okay, math disorders are very common, both in the general population and epilepsy. So there are a number of features, but it often feels to folks with math disabilities that they have a hard time learning and retaining new written math procedures. And they may feel like they grasp things like fractions, long division, long multiplication, kind of temporarily, but then it seems their understanding seems to fade, or they feel like they've never quite fully mastered those concepts. And what often can go along with this is trouble with math sense. So the logic behind why the math operations are done as they are may be elusive to them. The most common features, trouble memorizing math facts. And as for reading, those math troubles can parallel their kids' general cognitive development, and if they have some other delays. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then one final, the written language disorders, and this is really trouble with quantity and ease of written expression. It's not penmanship, it's not trouble forming the letters, although that can be hard for some kids when they're first learning to write. But this is trouble getting their thoughts down on paper. And often they have kind of a limited instinctive grasp for how a story goes. So they may not understand that stories might begin with, once upon a time, and it was just a normal spring day. Dan and Sally were having a picnic in the park, and kind of doing that kind of setup that one might do in a kind of a narrative text structure. And then they often have some difficulties in the host of skills that are needed for written language, and these include punctuation, spelling, and capitalization. So it's really all aspects of the writing process that can be hard. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there. We've covered a lot of territory, so I think we can open it up for questions.
Wonderful. We have some great questions coming in, Dr. Hempel. Would you mind putting your camera back on now, just so we can see?
Sure.
That would be wonderful.
Okay.
So lots of great questions. I want to just thank everyone again for staying with, and all of the great questions. We're just going to start from the top, and we'll probably do about 10 minutes of questions and answers. One of the first questions we got is, can vitamins help with memory, and are there any dietary suggestions to combat the effects of the epilepsy on the cognition and memory.
Right. This might be a better question for the medical professional. Being a psychologist, it's not my specialization, but I think what our epileptologists would probably say is we'd want to make sure the folks aren't deficient in things like vitamin D, or B vitamins, or choline. Choline is a common nutrient important for memory, so making sure you're eating eggs and the egg yolks would be helpful. There's some recent data on choline supplementation being helpful for folks with dementia, so kind of age-related memory decline. But again, this is not my specialization, so that might be a good discussion to have with the primary care provider, for example.
Wonderful. Sounds good. Next question is short or long-term memory problems indicative of particular types of seizures? So I think the question here is there are certain types of seizures where short and long-term memory are impacted more or less?
So if we go back, the kind of memory, again, that working memory, immediate memory, that's unrelated to a specific seizure type or focus. Let's see, I'm trying to think of, go back to prospective memory, remembering to do, that's unrelated to a specific seizure type. Really the only, well, let me just say that there can be, some language and learning disabilities related to epilepsy that has a focus in the language dominant hemisphere. So for most right-handers and even most left-handers, language is in the left. And so if you have a left hemisphere seizure focus, you might have some trouble with remembering new words, remembering or knowing how to read, or being a good reader, remembering math skills. But really when we think about the kind of memory that can tell us maybe a little bit about a person's seizure disorder, if they're really having trouble remembering new content, new, again, what details of what they read, details of conversations, new routes, new faces, again, if they have trouble remembering new stuff, and it's not because they're not paying attention, and it's not because they've got a high medication burden, then you would ask your epileptologist, I suppose, could this mean that my temporal lobes are involved in my seizure disorder?
Thank you for that. Next question is, in regards to seizures and medications impact on cognition, do you have suggestions for some of the best teaching approaches? Does rote learning have any measurable positive impact, or is it a reasonable expectation?
Okay. Yeah. So I think when we think about medications, because if medications slow you down and make you a less efficient learner, we try to, as much as possible, make the learning process efficient. This means, if it's math skills that you're concerned about, for example, there are some, math fact exercises that are pretty efficient and pretty low effort, and that would be, and I don't have the links for those, but if somebody wanted to email, I'd be happy to email some links for math skills, for example. And I forgot the their strategy. Oh, rote learning, for example. Yeah. So again, we have to think back to kind of earlier when I discussed how it helps to think very deliberately about what you want to read or learn, that is. And so that means kind of thinking actively about the to be learned information and keeping it really down to kind of the essentials of what you have to remember. So I think those would probably be some basic principles, not necessarily whether rote learning itself or other strategies are helpful.
Next question is knowing the word in your mind, but struggling to speak it, more about a memory or a language issue. Is that a,
Yeah, so
I
if
think
it feels
I'm saying that right.
for the tongue, if it feels like a tip of the tongue, you kind of, you just, you know the word, you just can't think of it. Let me just say from experience, age does not help. So this is a problem that we all suffer eventually. But yeah, if you're a young person, otherwise healthy, yeah, this would be more of a language, typically a language issue. Yeah.
Great. What kind of effect can alcohol have on cognition, memory, and seizures? Is there any correlation between that? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I will stay away from, you know, whatever impact it could have on seizures, but we generally think of those kinds of substances, whether it be alcohol, marijuana, those are not helpful for mental efficiency, and drugs that can interfere with the quality of one's sleep also would not be expected to help mental efficiency. There's some data in teenagers, older teens, college age kids who, the ones who do use cannabis pretty routinely perform less well on memory tasks. Doesn't give them impaired memory. I mean, it's still broadly normal, but they are less efficient. So I think if you're a daily cannabis, this is different from cannabidiol. Cannabidiol is fine. The medical grade or Epidiolex, that's fine. That you're not going to interfere with memory. But products with THC and cannabis, that you're not going to find your memory helped at all by routine use of those products.
Right. Just a couple more questions, and I know that we may not get to all of the questions. And just so our attendees, remember, you can always reach out, ask those questions via email to us as well, and we can get the answers. A couple more. Can you talk about epileptic encephalopathy and its effect on cognition? How to combat it?
So I think maybe what the question is referring to is just kind of a lot of epileptiform activity.
Yeah.
So whether or not there's a lot of seizures, but what you see on EEG, we think of this as an epileptic encephalopathy because of the pretty continuous epileptiform discharges. Let me just say that there is not a direct correlation between frequency of those discharges and cognition. In general, folks do better when they have fewer epileptiform discharges, but we know from the kids with electrical status epilepticus in sleep, for example, that they can have pretty high burden of epileptiform discharges and still be functioning fairly normally. So, and we've seen the converse as well. We've seen a much improved EEG, and yet they may have with their form of electrical status epilepticus in sleep, even with that improved EEG, they have a regression in language. So, there isn't a strong relationship. So there's, I know physicians will often try to again, minimize that epileptiform activity, but that doesn't necessarily lead to improvement in thinking, because there isn't always a direct correlation.
Okay. One question here, you mentioned, what is TCI?
Oh, transitory cognitive impairment, or some people say transient cognitive impairment or transitory cognitive impairment.
All right. Oh God, we just keep getting them. Okay. One last one I think that we'll do. And this is something that you might have right off the tip of your tongue, but something that we can follow up with. Are there any books or literature or that you recommend for people with epilepsy to help with cognition and memory if they feel like that's something they're struggling with?
You know, I would it doesn't have to be specifically for folks with epilepsy. So there may be self-help books that if you look at ways of facilitating memory, you may find on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Just browse the books that suggest memory strategies, and often will be of the character like we talked about, ways to think deliberately about what you want to remember and make your memory more efficient by kind of organizing the information you want to remember.
And several people asked those types of questions related to suggestions you have for daily things to do to help with your memory and cognition. One of the things I was just going to mention to the whole group is those are certainly some things we can put in our some suggestions resources that we know of. We can put that in our email that we send out to all attendees afterwards too. So we'll provide some resources as well in that follow-up email, some links and things. So I think we're going to pause here on the question and answers. Again, just want to thank everybody for all of the great questions. And if you did have a question that did not get answered, please feel free to reach out to one of us at EFMN. We will work to get that question answered. But I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica here for the last slide or two.
Hi. So I was just going to go over what our mission is here at the Epilepsy Foundation in Minnesota. We lead the fight to overcome the challenges of living with epilepsy and to accelerate therapies to stop seizures, find cures, and save lives. We've already gone over some of our other client services that we offer. And we've already gone over our webinars and when we hope to post them by the 1st of the year. So you can sign up for those and hopefully attend another webinar too. I apologize for all of our technical difficulties, and I appreciate everyone coming. So thank you very much, and have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. Hempel.
Yes, thank you. It was my pleasure.